It's my absolute pleasure to be here talking with you about one of my favorite topics to nerd out about, for sure. So in this introduction to digital preservation, we really are gearing towards an introductory level. So those who have little to no experience or are looking to expand upon perhaps what they already know on that. So don't get scared, there's no technical background necessary going forward. So we're gonna introduce you, and I promise you'll be almost experts by the end of this. So there we go. So digital preservation in the context, of course, that we're speaking on is simply ongoing actions taken to keep digital content accessible over time. We're trying to prevent things like corruption or bit rot or, all these horrible scary errors that we get when we try to open a digital file and for whatever reason it won't open or it's not displaying properly. I hate to say it, but we've probably all seen something like this at some point in time, and it's probably caused us a lot of havoc, and we wish we could avoid it altogether. And so the Library of Congress has put together a nice educational modules for how to get started with digital preservation and how to avoid those horrible instances of corruption that we don't want to encounter. And so this is the framework that we'll be working in today. So the first module, we're going to talk about identification, or identifying what digital content you have. We're going to talk about selection and what portion of that digital content that you have will be preserved. We'll talk about storage and what issues go along with that for long term. Protection, or what steps are necessary to protect your digital content. Risk management and those sorts of things. We'll talk about the ongoing management provisions that are needed for that for the long term. And finally, we'll talk about providing access and what things to keep in mind when we're showing all the wonderful things we have to the world. So really, when we're talking about identification, we're talking about just figuring out what we have or what you have and where it is. So this may be digital files you have. They may be like digitized photographs, Word documents, PowerPoints, videos, emails, audio files, websites, software. Your digital content can come in many different forms. And the process of taking care of these typically in general terms are kind of going to be the same. So of all this different content you have, you also need to consider where it is, where it exists. So this may be on hard drives or jump drives, CDs. If you have some older content, maybe it's on floppy disks, or newer content coming in on laptops or tablets, even if these things are on servers that you host or in cloud storage hosted with someone else. So the reason we kind of want to know what we have and where it is because good preservation decisions are based on an understanding of the possible content to be preserved. We want to know where to start and what to prioritize. Otherwise, it can kind of be overwhelming to approach digital preservation. And so the easiest way to get organized and to get started is by creating an inventory. Now, the inventory doesn't have to be super complicated or in depth. You can start in generally any spreadsheet program. Most people have access to Excel or not Google Sheets or even Open Office or whatever spreadsheet program that you feel most comfortable in. And then you want to start to document information that is going to be important to you. So perhaps that's the location of that digital content, or what collection it's associated with, perhaps how old it is, or what date ranges are represented within the collection. What media or format it's on and the condition of that. Is it rotting away and deteriorating, or is it in pristine condition? Are there any sort of rights concerns automatically that hey, these things need to not see the light of day for a little while, or no, there's all in the public domain and we're ready to provide access to it. And of course, perhaps the size is going to be a determining factor. When we start talking about storage and location, already knowing the size of your digital content could come in handy later on. But ultimately, you want to determine what the appropriate level of detail is for you, and only you would know that at your institution. There could be even more information that would be pertinent to you, or maybe the things I mentioned don't apply to you for one reason or another. But the idea is to start simple and add additional information as you need to, as it serves you. And think of these inventories as living documents that are going to change over time. You hopefully will add more content. Maybe you'll find that a new column of information is needed. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, and it most likely never will be, but it will get you started and keep you organized and help you in the next phase of preserving your content, and that is selection, or picking what you're going to preserve and where exactly you're going to start. And I know the number one question that people have right here is, well, why can't I preserve all of it? Right? Everybody wants to save everything. And as noble as that is, unfortunately, it's not really realistic, mainly due to money. People say, you know, storage is getting increasingly cheaper as time goes on, but the management of that storage, your time and the information and effort you put into it, that's what's going to cost the money over the long term. So sadly, we can't save everything. Or even if we tried, you know, we put everything in today and tomorrow you'll get more information that you need to preserve or select from on that. So selection can be called different things in different contexts, right? Sometimes we call selection appraisal or acquisition, prioritization. In an academic setting, maybe this is a retention schedule or a mandatory deposit requirement. So while these are multiple terms, they all refer to the same principle. You have all of these wonderful flavors in which to pick from, and sadly you can only go with a few at a time. Or ideally one flavor at a time, unless you're those weird people that like to mix ice cream flavors. They exist. So, but when you're considering what factors to look at for picking the content for preservation, you may want to start with what's most fragile or what's most at risk. Maybe something that is highly used for you, or your flagship materials that are most significant to you. Maybe you want to start with what's going to be the easiest thing, kind of the snowball method to get you started. Or maybe you want to eat the frog first and go with the hardest thing. Maybe you want to start with the smallest to kind of get your wheels under you, or the largest to you know, get the bulk of it behind you the fastest. Again, it could be the newest or the oldest materials, you know, whatever is going to work best for you in your institution as your starting point. And hopefully you may already have some documents in place to be able to help you with this. And typically those would be like your collection development policies, things that dictate what you're going to keep permanently, typically inform what you're going to preserve permanently, right? So when we're looking at selection, the steps around this, of course, are to review that inventory that we created in the first place, right? And determine those selection criteria of what's going to be important to you. And then after that, document those decisions. We're going to talk a lot about continuity and keeping things going beyond you at your institution. And that starts with documentation of, so that not only can you remember why you made a certain decision, but those that come after you will know why you made that decision as well, and hopefully make similar decisions based off the same criteria. While we all, even our one-man shows, when it's just you and your institution that's taking care of this, hopefully the work that we produce long outlasts us and outlasts our institution, ideally, hopefully. So having that mindset of looking towards the future will make things a lot easier if you begin with the end in mind, so to speak. And then, of course, after all of that is documented, you're going to implement those decisions. And really that means we're just going to start storing the content. You're going to choose what the best storage solution is for you, and we're going to talk about some of those, and then use it. So you may be asking, you know, what exactly am I storing? Because it's not just the files. You want to store the metadata alongside that. And those two together, the file and the metadata, is what we refer to as digital objects. So it's kind of difficult to know what is about a file without, my apologies. It's kind of difficult to understand what a file is about without the metadata. If you don't have that descriptive information, you may not know what's inside it without having to open it up. So those two together are vital to keep alongside of each other so that you can interpret what your content is so that it makes sense going forward. So when we're talking about files, right, there's a million different file formats out there in the world that we could take advantage of or store in. And what we want to do is to use established standards, things that are widely adopted, that are stable, that would be easily identifiable and verifiable, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, going forward. And some examples of that for, say, your master files that you create in digitization, for instance, might be saving them in a TIFF format or a PDF, perhaps a WAV or AVI. And of course, these are not the end-all be-all. These are not the only options available to you. They're just, you know, some examples, some common ones that we see a lot. And then, of course, for access images, we see JPEGs, again, we see PDFs, we see MP3 files, we see MP4 files. And again, those are just examples of possible standards to go forward with. And the Library of Congress has a wonderful file format recommendation site if you're interested in exactly what file formats for you to be using. So in addition to those file formats, that metadata that I talked about being so vitally important, because that's really is what's going to make long-term preservation possible. So metadata, simply the descriptive information about an item, is going to help you uniquely identify those files like I was talking about. It's going to help you make those objects understandable long into the future, and not just so you understand them, but that so other people can understand them as well. And it's also going to be able to help you track to make sure that the object is authentic or that there's no problems with it going forward. And it's really going to document kind of that life cycle, the whole life story of your digital content. And again, this could all be stored in that spreadsheet, in that inventory, where you start out simple and add to it as it goes along. So when you're looking at what types of metadata to keep, what type of things to keep track of, you know, we want to look at our administrative metadata, things that help us manage. Perhaps that's rights information, permissions information, certainly maybe location information. The structural metadata that helps us understand that, you know, the front cover comes before page 1 and that everything stays in the proper order that it should be. Naturally, the descriptive information we absolutely want to keep, things that help us find and use it, like title and dates and creators and that type of information. And all of this combined serves out the preservation metadata, which will help keep track of that file over time and help you preserve it over time. The more information you know, the more informed decisions that you can make later on. And part of the technical metadata, this preservation metadata, for making sure that a file is going to be unchanged, is a concept that we call fixity. Now, fixity is simply making sure that your files are unchanged in, you know, a fixed form. And we do this by calculating a checksum, and checksums work like digital fingerprints for your files. So you run you have a computer run an algorithm, and it spits out a series of letters and numbers like what you see at the bottom left of your screen. And I know if I run that algorithm today and I get that string and I run it again in 2 weeks, I should get that same string. And if I don't, I know there's been some change to the file and I know potentially I have a problem. So some examples of algorithms that can be run are SHA-256 and MD5. And we see a lot of MD5 out there in the field because it's shorter, it's faster to run, and it's reliable typically for cultural heritage materials. Now, if you were dealing something that had like legal implications, that's when you want to consider like a SHA-256, a longer, more complicated algorithm, so to speak, to ensure the authenticity of those files. But very simple programs can help you get started with these sorts of things. MD5 Summer, for example, or AV Preserves Fixity is a great one to automate these things. And File Verifier++ is another one. Those are all Windows examples, but if you're working off a different operating system, we can talk about, let me know and we can give you some other examples on that. And all of that information, of course, goes into the metadata for your preservation for long term, so you can keep track of whether or not this file has changed over time. And that's going to be, of course, vital for that preservation and long-term access of that file. So all of that, hold on with me. Where are we going to put it? We know what file format we're going to be. We know what descriptive information we're going to put alongside it. We've done all the complicated technical identification for our Fixity. Now, what do we do with this? So a lot of that, again, the lawyer answer of, it's going to depend. And this depends on what resources you have available to you. The cost that you have, the size of data we're talking about, what skills you have, if this is something that you want to take on yourself or if this is something you want to hire out for. What partnerships you may have with other institutions. Perhaps there's other places that can help one another out. And of course, those services that may or may not be available to you are all going to inform these decisions. But ultimately, the big takeaway here is to keep at least 2 copies of your digital files in at least 2 places. And that's for if you run that checksum and you find an error, you can go to your other copy and overwrite the bad file, right? And we say at least 2. More copies, of course, are better. If you've heard of the LOCKSS system, the acronym literally stands for lots of copies keep stuff safe. And it's built off the principle that the more copies that you have, the less likelihood of multiples being corrupted at the same time. So if you have at least 2, right, you can overwrite a bad file. But if you have 3, now you have a tiebreaker, and that if you have one file that's running one checksum and another one that's running a separate one, and you're perhaps not sure which one is the correct master file, you have a tiebreaker with a third. So that can help you going forward. But for Library of Congress, the absolute minimum that's recommended is at least 2 copies in at least 2 places. And the other big thing when we talk about storage is to plan for storage replacement. Sadly, computers don't last indefinitely, right? Eventually, a new computer is going to be necessary. Likewise, a new storage environment or a new storage media would be necessary over time as well. And this may be, every 3 to 5 years, you buy a new external hard drive and just move all your content over to a fresh hard drive. Perhaps it means a complete server change out on a regular basis. But it's not just, I've put it in this location and now I'm set for life. You have to plan for the ongoing care of those materials, including the hardware that it's going to be stored on. So when we talk about that hardware, or what do I store these digital objects on, we have some storage trends that have changed over time. So we started out with things like what we call tape media. So most people can envision like a big cassette or like a VHS. If you open up one of those tapes, there's that tape inside. And that was great for the time period that it was around for, but sadly, tape can break, it can fade, it can warp, and it can have all sorts of problems long term. So ultimately, we went away from tape and then we moved over to optical. And that's optical, easy examples of that are like CDs and DVDs and Blu-ray, things like that. Most or the old original hard drives of computers are actually optical media. If you were to open it up, it'd be like a spinning CD inside. It almost looks like a combination between a CD on a record player with an arm. Is kind of what the internal workings of a hard drive look like. And of course, CDs are, or any type of optical media really, is not going to be the best media to store on, particularly not long term. It's called transferable for a reason. We want to move it from one place to another, it's typically okay. But if we want to store it permanently, optical is probably not the way to go. The unfortunate image you see here is a real life example. So this was a CD that I had come across in a case file, and it was improperly stored and it was improperly labeled. And so we were like, well, what's on this? So we put it in my computer and started it up, and we heard the worst sound that I hope never to hear again in my life. And then when I opened up my disk drive, just pieces of this disk fell out, including those little black pieces in the top left corner. Those are actually pieces of my disk drive out of my computer. So, you know, not the best occurrence to have happen. Thankfully, we did end up determining that it was a copy of a disk, and the original disk was stored properly in the collection as it should have been and properly labeled. So thank goodness no content was actually lost, but it very easily could have been in that. And also, if you happen to come across media like this in your collections that you're trying to move off to a safer environment, it does help to take the CD and put it on a flat surface and make sure that it's not warped before you put it in your disk drive. And if you do that step, then you hopefully can avoid that horrible occurrence that happened to me. So after optical, we moved on to solid state, and this is kind of where we are today in terms of storage. So solid state, it has solid, as the name implies. There's no moving parts, so there's less risk of things breaking. So we see solid state in our hard drives now, in like our cell phones are solid state, jump drives are solid state, examples like that. So there's no moving parts to break, so they typically last a little longer. And then of course, from solid state, we have what's all the rage right now, which of course is cloud storage. And really all cloud storage is a server farm, is a whole bunch of computers in one place that is replicated somewhere else as well, that constantly talk to one another. So if one server goes down, the other one can come up and take its place. So we have this appearance of constant access to it. And cloud storage can be very helpful for digital preservation and helping you keep those multiple copies in multiple locations, sort of thing. Like Amazon has plans like this. Well, typically the big ones you see are going to be Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, right? Have different options for cloud storage that get more expensive the fancier they get, but those are options that are available to you, so you don't have to worry about storing it locally if you don't want to. If you do, if cloud storage is outside your range, external hard drives have come down in price dramatically. And so of course we go with at minimum 2 copies in at least 2 locations, and that could be on your computer and on an external hard drive that perhaps you take home with you, or on an external hard drive that you send to another branch in your library system. That way, and perhaps they send you theirs, so you can back one another up in that sort of capacity. And so this really helps if, unfortunately, if a natural disaster occurs and your library takes damage, you haven't lost all that content, right? There's another copy of it elsewhere that you could restore from, so all of that is preserved going forward. So storage doesn't have to be super complicated or super expensive. You start where you can and then expand as you need to, if you need to. But at some point, it could be helpful to consider an actual storage system or database. And there are a lot of options that are available for this. You can buy a ready-made option. You can build one yourself if you have those skills or know someone that does have those skills. Or you can join a consortium that kind of takes care of all of those server things for you, something like MetaArchive or like a lock system for that. Then there's also options for, going with some open source solutions that you can, something like DSpace, that you can download yourself and build out. if that is within your skill set or a skill set you super want to learn. There's also proprietary options, of course, that you can pay for, that you don't have to do any sort of coding. You can let someone else take care of it altogether. And likewise, there's also that local or hosted option, whether these are things that you store yourself in your library or whether it's hosted with some cloud provider out there that's taking care of that for you. But a couple things to consider with that is how easy is it going to be on you to install and manage this, if it's something that you want to take on or can take on, or if it's easier to have somebody else take care of that for you. Or another consideration is, of course, the ease of exporting that content to something else. Like we talked about before, of planning for storage replacement, of how media changes over time, right? Nothing is going to be static permanently. So you kind of want to keep the end in mind when you're starting in the beginning of how easy is it going to be to move this content to a new system. If you're evaluating some vendor to take care of your materials and they can't tell you what happens if they go out of business, or how to be able to get your content out, perhaps it's worth questioning that particular solution a little further before you go with them, because you want to make sure that your content is safe and that you're going to be able to keep it safe moving forward. So ultimately, you have to decide what is going to be best for you for now. And just know that your options and your solutions are going to change over time, and that's okay. Nothing is permanent, so we want to be flexible in what our solutions could look like. Past storing materials, now we're going to talk about kind of safeguarding your digital content. And sadly for digital content, as nothing is permanent, right, there could be a lot of risks to this. We talked about kind of nothing being permanent in terms of hardware or software, but we also have risks like loss of power or changes. We kind of talked about Fixity to make sure that doesn't happen, that bit rot doesn't happen. We have user errors that cause problems. Unfortunately, there are things that are cyber attacks and man-made and natural disasters. And one of the biggest ones that wreak havoc on computers, of course, is dust. So keeping things dust-free is always a good tip on that as well. But with all of these kind of risks that are possibilities, you have to kind of take some steps to protect your content in this risk management process. So identifying what the possible risks to your content may be, and defining those in their nature and scope. Are you in an area that is prone to tornadoes or prone to flooding, or given Georgia, probably not prone to earthquakes, but or volcanoes. But depending on where you are in the world, those could be considerations to keep in mind. And you want to look at what is the possible damage that could come from some of those threats, and then how theoretically would you recover from that? What plan would you put in place? Does your institution have a disaster recovery plan? And if so, is your digital content covered in that plan? If not, could be a good thing to look at adding in. Every once in a while, it could be helpful to go ahead and implement that plan and to walk through a scenario as if a disaster had occurred. So the more preparation we have ahead of time, the lower likelihood of a risk causing that much havoc, right? But ultimately, with all of these things, a really good piece of advice to keep in mind is to make sure that no one person has write privileges to all copies, meaning that no one person could change every copy of a file that you may have. And this is not necessarily to prevent malicious changes, though that could be a thing as well, but accidental changes. When somebody's makes a change and they figure out they did not mean to, you don't want them to have overwritten all of your copies to something. Even where I'm at, I don't have write privileges to all of my copies. I can change my local one, but I don't have access to my backup to be able, our IT department does, to be able to change that particular copy. So having that safety net there, kind of those checks and balances, will of course keep your content safe long term as well. So really all of this, we're looking at kind of like what our readiness is. And so with proper planning, you can help prevent those undesirable outcomes and, predict what's your most likely risks or threats that you might encounter and how to detect those errors or problems. And, we talked about checksums and Fixity to help detect problems. And then how to respond with appropriate measures so that you're ready for those instances to occur. And of course, how to repair, if necessary, any sort of damage or potential loss. And all of this is extraordinarily important to document, right? To document, document, document. And where we're at, I have this thing we call the truck book. And the whole point of a truck book is if I were to be hit by a truck today, this is the book that could help keep everything going. So it includes all of our procedures, all of our policies, all of the nitty-gritty so that all of the preservation is not reliant on me to physically, personally be here. Anybody could pick up that book and keep everything going. It also works great as a training manual. So as we have new employees that come on or employees that leave, we have that continuity of practice so that things continue on as we want them to, as we intend them to. So while it's kind of morbid to be thinking about getting hit by a truck, it is absolutely helpful for preservation's perspective. So some more documentation that could be really helpful in that are things like your emergency team roster with phone numbers. If the building was to lose power, who would you call? And to have that in a printed form as well as a digital form so that if you don't have any power, you are not reliant on a computer to be able to find a phone number. Having it printed can be invaluable in those situations. What your list of risks and threats are and what your disaster recovery plan is, a list of who all your system users are, what their credentials if necessary, and access permissions if necessary, and all of those policies and procedures, as I mentioned before. So any sort of continuity plan to keep things going for the status quo, that is our main goal with some of the digital preservation documentation here. And so, kind of in that same vein, moving into managing this material long term, it's really making sure that you have all of your ducks in a row and a very balanced approach. So these will help you address any sort of organizational requirements, the technical changes that happen, and your resources, managing all of that. And you may be sitting here saying, I have no resources. I am my digital preservation team and I have no funding whatsoever and it's just me. Well, you are your resource then. And, a couple external hard drives, for instance, can be your equipment on that. So making sure that you have the funding to be able to replace those when necessary, or when another technological opportunity comes along, that you're prepared for that you know how to get your content out to be able to move it to something else, whether that's simply a copy and paste or whether it's a more in-depth process depending on what your solution is. So in the past, we've seen digital preservation represented as this three-legged stool, this balanced management between your technology, your organization, and your resources that are available to you. And in the past couple of years, the community has noticed that the vital thing that's missing from that three-legged stool is your digital content, what it is that you're preserving, what all of this is going to serve. And so now the recommended image is kind of this triad that you see, this interconnectedness between the management, which encompasses your organization and your resources, the technology component, and of course, all of your content, all of those files, all of the metadata, all of that sort of information. So in those management roles and responsibilities, it's really helpful for you to know where your content is. Right? Is it on-site with you? Is it off-site? Is it offline in like an external hard drive, or is it online in the cloud? Knowing where it is and who can have access to it is vitally important. If you need to manage authentication information for logging into a system, You know, that's important information to keep track of, as well as regularly reviewing your process and making adjustments, right? It's a learning process. Nobody is going to get it perfect. As a matter of fact, I personally don't believe that there is anything such as perfect digital preservation. Everybody can always change and improve and grow on this. Personally, it's one of the things that I love about it, because if it was all static, I would get very bored. But there's always something new to learn, something new to implement that can enhance what you're doing. And that's the exciting part for that. So you have to be open for that flexibility for those adjusting practices as new things come. So hopefully you have some people around you that could help. Maybe somebody that's really skilled with project management or policy development, or metadata for cataloging, things like that. Maybe that legal expertise to kind of look at copyright or rights information, or even marketing expertise to be able to say, hey, this is something that we're doing. Let's apply for these grants to be able to help serve these needs. Around there. So just because you don't have somebody absolutely dedicated to this doesn't mean that there aren't other people that could potentially assist you in one way or another to make this kind of a group effort. And we've talked lots about policies, of collection development policies and those sorts of things, but it's also helpful to have a preservation policy, right? Documenting those selection decisions that we talked about earlier, that specifies that your institution is going to be committed to keeping this content long term, or what people may be able to help you with that, specifying that out so that it's a responsibility in their job description, ideally, right? Or a responsibility in your job description for you. Or even if we're looking at, say, like a volunteer situation, having that preservation policy can also build confidence in you and in the organization you're volunteering with, to help with stakeholders and people who are willing to give you materials. If they have a choice between, say, two different historical societies, if they're looking between like a county one and a city one, something like that, and you can show them, hey, this is what we do to take care of your digital content that you potentially may have, that's certainly going to work in your favor for building that trust and relationship with donors. So that can be extraordinarily helpful and also help raise awareness of what you're doing, so that perhaps people will support you in your efforts in this type of work. So of course, we can't talk about management without talking about technology, of having to you know, prioritize what requirements you need if storage is going to be a requirement this year, right? Maybe you absolutely need to prioritize getting another computer or another hard drive or whatever it is that's going to help you fill in those gaps. Maybe it's helping to assess and plan to identify what your goals are going to be and how you're going to move forward. Of course, deciding whether you want to build something, buy something, join something that technology-wise to help make things easier. And we've already talked about funding a little bit. We'll talk about it here more in just a second, to make sure that there's resources available, even if they're minor resources, even if you are the resource. Is helpful to look ahead and be prepared as best as possible, and then always measure those outcomes and define what success is going to be or potentially can be, so that you can always improve on those measures and have that sense of accomplishment, but also ensure that that material, your digital material, is as safe as it could possibly be. If you're in such a situation where you can have designated funding, of course that's ideal, right? Everybody wants designated funding for everything, but funds set aside specifically for digital preservation, and it may not necessarily be a budget line, an item line in your budget, but some sort of indication of your intent to preserve that shows that institutional commitment can be extraordinarily helpful, not only for donors to help convince them to trust you with their materials, but also for granting agencies, so that you can show you're going to give us this money to help us undertake this project, and this is how we're going to be able to care for those outcomes going forward. So it really helps build that track record for you of making sure that you're a trustworthy taking care of this materials. And of course, there's, it's the library world, right? So there's standards for everything, which is helpful in a lot of cases and can also be overwhelming when you're looking at all of these possibilities for certifications, to be a trustworthy digital repository and all the hoops to jump through to be one of those, or looking at ISO models, or what standards to use of how to fill out certain metadata fields, things like that. You can find a standard for just about everything, right? And consistency, which is the whole point of standards, you know, consistency is key and king going forward, can be really beneficial when everything is done the same way. And my favorite example of this is how to write a date, right? Specifically, if you're dealing with material international in scope, where dates could be represented in different formats, it's imperative that you have a consistent way to represent. And the best way, especially in a computer, is going to be 4 digits for the year, 2 digits for the month, 2 digits for the day. And that's so when the computer organizes your files, everything is correctly chronologically ordered, right? So that you don't have all your Januaries together and all your Februaries together. It's actually done by year in chronological order. So the Levels of Digital Preservation is a document that's put out by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, and originally in collaboration with the Library of Congress as well. That can kind of help you assess where you are in digital preservation and perhaps identify some additional steps to take in order to improve those measures. So I've provided the link for you here, and of course it's very Googleable. We'll make that a word for today. It's just important to note that while this chart is still valid, it is under revision to expand slightly and to clarify a lot of the language. So if you find it overwhelming, just hang on. There should be a better version coming soon. But this could be a great way to help you get started and identify where you want to go. Because ultimately, all of this is for you to be able to put your content out into the world for people to see it, right? To provide access. And providing access goes hand to hand with preserving content. It's really hard to provide access for something that you can't preserve. And it's very hard to preserve, well, at least I would caution you to question preserving something that you would never ever be able to provide access for, right? Maybe that's potentially a waste of resources in that situation. So these really are kind of two sides of the same coin. It's that preservation that is going to make that long-term access even possible. But when we're talking about, you know, preservation versus access here, they kind of rely on different types of technology. You want your preservation to be that proven technology that's going to be able to stand the test of time as much as technology can stand the test of time. That's going to accumulate all the metadata of a digital object. So a way to build on that. If you're working in a system that would create a new version of this as file formats change over time. And so really a preservation is looking at that long-term access, right? That focuses on those future users for what's going to be best served long-term, versus kind of an access system where you can be a little more cutting edge, a little more flashy and showy. You can select what metadata is going to be perfect for your users, for your patrons, what type of file formats are going to be they're most likely going to want and use. So providing that content to your users for your current users and meeting those needs is kind of where access is. A good analogy here is we have, say, like a public library and an archive. So your archive is going to do all the preservation work. Those materials don't circulate or leave. So that's the long-term copy, versus a public library, a circulating library, where if a book is destroyed, not that it's not a big deal, but you typically can get another copy, or hopefully be able to get another copy to replace it. So you're not really worried about keeping the one and only safe for forever, right? That's kind of the difference here between the preservation and access. We want to care for these things long term, while also, you know, meeting our current users' needs for how they want to get access to them. And of course, we cannot have a conversation about access without somewhat talking about rights and permissions, or at least having an awareness of what those issues may be. A great resource, if you have not visited before, is the copyright chart that Cornell maintains. That is the copyright term in the public domain for the United States that helps you determine what the copyright status of a published work would be. So that can be very helpful going forward. If you don't have copyrights to make something public, when would you have copyrights to make something public? And is that worth preserving that content as you go forward? So lastly, when we talk about kind of that access software, again, it's going to be choosing what's right for you. If it's going to be an open source thing that you build and support yourself, perhaps it's helpful to have a developer if you're super fancy, or there's another one that you can call on or hire out with a grant, something like that. But typically open source softwares, they're free like puppies, right? You still have to do the upkeep and the maintaining and take it for a walk and all that fun things. So it can be cheaper to get going, but it's certainly a commitment as well. Or you can go with like a proprietary option. We see like Content DM all the time. That's an established vendor that's going to meet your needs, where there's typically a contract or an obligation to you to keep these things available for users. And that may come with some higher upfront costs. It may not. It's depending on your situation. So you always have those options to, buy, build, or join for what's going to work best for you. But hopefully you've seen through the course of all of this that, digital preservation is going to be an ongoing commitment, right? It's not, sadly, it's not a one and done. It's not something that you can do over the weekend and then never have to think about again. But the good part to this is you are not alone. I've yet to meet somebody who works with digital preservation who isn't thoroughly enthusiastic to help out, to answer questions, to brainstorm ideas, whatever it is to take you from your starting point to where you want to go. So there's lots of resources that are available, the National Digital Stewardship Alliance and Library of Congress and the Digital Library Federation, of course the Digital Library of Georgia. All of these wonderful resources are available to you to help meet your needs. So you're absolutely not alone. So I hope you've found this presentation helpful, and see if we have any questions coming in.